welcome to today's remote session. This is Tom Bechtold, of course, from SecureWorld Digital. Today, we're going to be talking about how to mitigate risk and comply with SEC disclosure requirements, the regulation versus reality. And this is coming from, obviously the announcements that we've heard recently. A lot of people starting to get a little worried about this stuff, and maybe they should be, right? So let's kind of get into stuff. We've got a lot of ground to cover. We've got 3 experts that we've invited to the program today. And I want to say thank you to the folks over at Spirion for making today's remote session possible. So thank you over at Spirion. And who are we going to be talking to? I'm going to tell you in just a second. I've got a housekeeping slide that I need to go through just for the new folks. So we have a bunch of stuff loaded up in the resource tab. I've got some different PDFs and URLs in there from the folks over at Spirion. There's also some SecureWorld stuff in there for our upcoming events and whatnot. We're taking your questions, so please throw questions into the Q&A. I'm going to be fielding those. I'll be trying to get those out to our presenters as they go through, and then we'll kind of do a group Q&A at the end as well. So there is a certificate of attendance that you can download after about 45 minutes. That's good for 1 CPE credit for today's program. If you lose audio or have any kind of video issues, things like that, F5 or function F5 generally fixes most of the problems, or change your browser. Usually Edge, Chrome, Safari work pretty well. Let's see, we are recording this, so if you hear stuff that you like and you want to come back to it or share it with a colleague, please do. That link that you used today to join, you can share that with anybody. And we also have part 2 coming up in a couple of weeks. I've got a link in the resource tab for that as well, so if you want to join again for that. So, okay, that being said, I'm going to skip my comments. I really don't have much to say, frankly, on this topic. That's why I invited 3 experts. So that's what we're doing here today. So who do we have here? I've got Aidan Simister, and I'm sorry, Aidan, if I pronounced your last name wrong. He's the co-founder and CEO at Lepide. If you wouldn't mind, Aidan, give us a little bit of your backstory. Give us about 90 seconds. Where are you from and what's cooking?
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, thanks so much for that, Tom. Yeah, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Lepide. I've worked in information security now for the best part of 20-odd years, I suppose. And for me, I'm really passionate about data security and a few specific, and I have been for many years, because I really kind of felt security was inside out. I felt that there was so much security that was focused on the perimeter, and I'm like, well, surely it's all about the data. It's all about understanding, what data you've got, understanding who's got access to it, what's going on with it. So, I set up Lepide 8 years ago now, and yeah, super exciting. We're growing really quick. It's a really interesting place to be.
Excellent. Great to have you, sir. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments on our topic today. So stay tuned. We'll come back to you in just a bit. Violet Sullivan, the VP of Client Engagement at Redpoint. Violet, first time on our program here. Great to have you. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background or backstory?
Yes, thank you so much. So for Aidan, 25 years, by the way, is like a dinosaur in cybersecurity, because it's such a new field. I love hearing that background. I only have 10 years, which also feels veteran status in such a fast growing field. But I serve as the intermediary between the partners that we work with on cyber insurance and lawyers that respond to cyber incidents and our forensics team. So Redpoint Cybersecurity is a forensics team that also does preventative cybersecurity. We're the services, the action that deal with responding to events that occur, looking at what happened, and getting companies back into a place where we can restore their business activity. I also teach privacy and cyber law at Baylor Law School's LLM program in litigation management.
Great to have you, and always fun to hear about the forensic stuff. I always like that piece of it. So welcome, and thanks for joining us. And Sam Masiello, Chief Information Security Officer at Anschutz Corporation and longtime friend of the SecureWorld family. Sam and I actually kind of started the Denver event for SecureWorld. So Sam, welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Looking forward to hearing what Aidan and Violet have to say. I'm just going to try to keep up with them, I think, for most of this conversation. But been in security for a long time. Been a CISO or CISO level roles for the past over 15 years. Like Aidan, long-time dinosaur in security. In fact, I've known since I started running messaging systems at the age of 13 that I knew I wanted to be in security. So this has always been the path I wanted to follow, and it's always been just extremely interesting to me. And it's great to see how not only has the role evolved, has how security has evolved, excuse me, but also looking into now how SEC is getting more involved in cyber regulation and starting to impose some more rules and policies and requirements around what they expect from companies, especially as breaches have become normal, right? 10 years ago, breaches were news, and now they're sub-headlines underneath pretty much everything else because they're so commonplace. You read a headline that says 50 million records were breached from a company today, and you don't even really bat an eye at it anymore, which is kind of sad and scary at the same time. But like I said, looking forward to the discussion today, and happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Excellent. Welcome. All right, let's get going here. Let's start things off a little bit here. I would actually like Violet, you're our legal expert here. If you wouldn't mind, kind of unpack these 3 disclosures that we kind of bore witness to, and help us understand this a little bit better, if you wouldn't mind.
So first of all, caveat that I always like to give is I came on the forensic side, so I don't have to lay out legal advice. So it's all purely extracurricular hobby, but as plain as the SEC has laid out the 3 disclosure updates, 2 of them deal with the response and required notification disclosure, what they're calling it disclosure instead of notification, which is a really well-used term in the data breach notification world. But there's 6K and 8K, 8K being 8K being the normal response and requirement for cybersecurity incident disclosure, and 6K being the one for foreign private issuers. So just a different class, similar things, right? Tell us if something material happened, which we'll get to. And then the other regulation is focused on, the other disclosure is focused on the annual disclosure for risk management, like basically CYA. How are the board of directors and officers covering their ability to protect themselves from material risks? What are they doing in terms of mitigating risk, assessing risks? How are they, it goes into a lot of detail, but basically what they're getting at is the oversight piece here. So I say that, 2 of them are really focused on that disclosure of cybersecurity incidents, which are only going to come up if there is a problem, whereas the SK item 106 is a risk management thing that's going to be yearly now. And these things are going to start coming into effect. So this is no longer you only have to tell us if something bad happens. It is you have to have an up-to-date process for risk management that can be explained and owned by the board of directors. I don't want to go into more detail unless you want to, but I was going to hand it over to the rest of the team.
Actually, I was going to ask you a couple of questions real quick. Where do you see kind of future conflicts happening around this? And guys, feel free to chime in if you've got some questions too.
I think the most obvious is what is material. And I think the big difference is, Sam, we talked before when we were prepping on how many different words have different definitions within legal, within security. Now we're adding another regulatory body that uses other words. And the one I always give is we have really different definitions of the word breach by itself. We're not arguing over that here, but I have gotten into multiple arguments with, but specifically security people that say, a breach, like you're breaching physical security, you're breaching the security. And I say, yes, I understand what you're saying, but breach is also the word used a lot in the required statutes and notifications. And if you use that word in law, it's going to go what is defined in that law, not your security professional colloquial response to it. So here we have a new word, material, which seems even broader than the word of what is a cyber incident, because we really settled on, okay, you see defined in contracts, in regulations worldwide, we're going to define what is an incident. And now, instead of just an incident, which is usually showing that there has been, the common definition is either unauthorized access of material that is confidential or sensitive as defined by that same statute, or if there is unauthorized access to the systems that actually hold the data. So it could be loss of the data or loss of integrity of the system access. Now, material what happens if there was something that the SEC would call material, like a huge drop in investor price based on a perception of event, but what if nothing happened? That's going to be the big question. Because if there's no big security incident, but they want to know, for instance, I think we're seeing this a lot with Move It, and I don't want to talk too long on this and hand it over to somebody, but I think we're going to see a lot of, wait a second, our fact doesn't fit the normal. Is it still material in order to report it?
And you may
Sam,
have some companies that are quite forthcoming in actually saying, well, this is a material breach, and some that don't. And actually, the people that are actually volunteering the information are going to end up looking worse. And
yes,
that's challenging.
It's going to be a disincentive to be
Exactly.
the good, honest, integrity-filled company.
Right. It's a bit too vague.
Well, it's also going to be a huge divide over who has outside counsel and who doesn't. And there are probably going to be differing opinions on outside counsel on, is this something that we're going to qualify? Because I will say, I'm very impressed when I'm on the forensic side, and when I watch breach counsel or incident response counsel work through a case, they're trying to work backwards and say, can you give us enough evidence to show that we did not have a breach, or kind of walking back from the definition. So I see that in this case, I would assume the lawyers would do the same thing. They're going to want to walk backwards, farther and farther away from the word material, in a way that can establish, like, here's the reasonable investigation that we did, and so that's why we did not call it material. So that if they ever get accused of not reporting it, they have a substantiated documentation on, we didn't think it was material because of XYZ element of P.
Since you stopped on P, let's put a pin in this, and let's jump over to Sam really quick. I want to get his opening comments as well. So let me pop over here, advance the right slide, please. There we go. Okay, so Sam, if you wouldn't mind, kind of give us your take on everything that we're hearing so far.
Yeah, so I like also say just to start, before I start off, that that picture on that slide is somewhat horrifying. I know it's not the same as the typical like hooded guy that's normally hunched over the keyboard that a lot of people use for like the hacker images, but that's kind of a scary picture to put up in front of people. But as we're talking about like materiality, right, and we're starting to talk about breach or incidents. I want to back up the discussion a little bit, because we're talking now about what to do when an incident actually happens. But from a CISO's perspective, we need to be thinking about how we start preparing for when those incidents happen, because whether we like it or not, or whether our business leaders or our board likes it or not, incidents are going to happen. And so what are the things we need to be doing now to prepare for that eventuality, and then figuring out, okay, what is this material or not? And then that's part of the discussion I think we need to be having now is, and as was noted a moment ago, materiality is really up to the organization to determine. What's material for one may not necessarily be material for another, but those conversations from a CISO's perspective should start happening now. Like figuring out with the organization, working with your business leaders to figure out what materiality means for that company. And I think that's actually one of the positives to come out of these regulations. And while for those on the call who have read the regulations, or at least are vaguely familiar with them from a CISO's perspective, there are some pros and cons both ways. But and we'll get into both of those, I'm sure, over the course of the discussion. But from my perspective, as you think about the things you need to be thinking about relative to how to start preparing, is working with your business leaders and starting to open up those discussions around what materiality means for that company. Because when you have an incident or when you have a breach is not the time to start figuring out, is this material or not? Within the language for the new rules, the trigger date, and some of the language changed, but the trigger date for disclosure is now based off of what they call the date of determination of materiality, not necessarily the date of discovery. And so what that also doesn't mean is that you don't have this infinitely long amount of time to figure out, is this material or not, even though you have the 4 days to disclose after you determine materiality. That doesn't mean you can take months and months to figure out whether or not this is material or not either. I think the language was changed, and Violet can correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm probably not going to use the right term of art, but I believe they changed the language from as soon as practicable to without unreasonable delay, which means that they expect you to already have had these conversations around what materiality means and already have prepared what fits into those definitions for an organization prior to the incident occurring. And so from a CISO perspective, if you're not already having those conversations with your business, if you're not already aligning with your business on what that means, and if you don't have, quite frankly, if you're not quite frankly having those conversations already with your leadership, you should be having them anyway as just part of your role. But a lot of times there is a bit of a, I don't know, it's a barrier or ceiling sometimes in CISOs having those meaningful conversations with executives because they're hard to have, in part because you are basically admitting that we're likely going to have an incident at some point. And that's a hard conversation to have when sometimes the board and the leadership team thinks, well, they hired you to make sure they don't have an incident. But really, at the end of the day, like it's more a matter of how you're going to manage that incident when it occurs. And so if you're not already lining up with the business on what's important to the business, what is critical to the business, what is going to end up being considered material, these new rules and regulations should really be driving those discussions to start happening.
And Sam, don't you think that's a really positive thing in some ways, though? Because that's going to actually kind of create that culture in which those conversations are going to have to be had. Like it won't be, you know, it's then taken much more seriously.
For sure.
I was just going to ask that same question.
Well,
done.
I would like to add to Sam, to what you were talking about, CISO. When the other change, so you mentioned the timing change and the wording around the timing, but the other change was there was a proposed part of this SEC rule, and I think it surprised a lot of people that the proposal of having some kind of cybersecurity representation among the board of directors and officers is now absent. It is conspicuously absent from what has come out. How does that change, and how do you think the security community proceed? Like, how did they react to that change?
Yeah, and so as I mentioned earlier, right, there's some positives and negatives to come out of it, and I think that was certainly one of the negatives to come out of it is the fact that the published rules, as you said, Violet, don't require any sort of disclosure as to what level of cybersecurity expertise exists on the board, and I think that's a big miss because from a CISO's perspective, it is important, I believe, to have that advocacy on the board. There are discussions, you know, when the CISO goes and meets with the board, typically they're not there for very long. They're part of a long agenda. And so, you know, you get a very limited amount of time to actually talk about whatever it is you want to talk about while you're there. But there are many other discussions that occur within the board's agenda or other things that they discuss, even outside of the regular board meetings that, quite frankly, do require or would be important to have somebody with some level of cyber expertise that can speak to the security side of the conversation that they may be having, whatever that is. And so without having somebody that has that, somebody having that expertise on the board, you miss part of that discussion from the standpoint of what would be important for security to either know or be aware of relative to some of the things that are being discussed at that level. And so not only do you potentially lose the ability to have that voice in the room, you also potentially lose that voice of advocacy among the board as well, as you potentially are looking for, maybe it's funding for additional projects or whatever it might be.
Well, you have me kind of thinking is like, how hard would it be to have enforced that, right? That would be my first question. Like, how could you have enforced that? And I guess my biggest question is there even a requirement? And I would have to look through SEC requirements of the board of directors that there even be a technology expert. Because if you deny a cybersecurity expert, I would sure as hell hope you have a technology brain because of all the interconnected ways that we do business. And, you know, Aidan, you work across the waters. You have offices in different locations. How could an organization like yours, Aidan, not have some kind of representative on cybersecurity? How would that be reasonable activity to not have that kind of person? Of course, you are that person for your organization, but to not have that representation on the board if you have multiple offices and use technology every day.
It'd be impossible. I mean, you absolutely need that advocacy. I mean, especially as you rightly say, everything's, you know, we're in this massive phase of digital transformation. Like technology is absolutely crucial to how we operate today, expedited by the pandemic. And it's unfathomable that you wouldn't have a technology advocate or expert on your board. I mean, I just can't imagine how that's realistic. And I do find it strange that there's no cybersecurity on the board. I mean, it's just such a fundamental part of your safety and security of your organizations nowadays. It doesn't make sense to me.
But I would say also that, boards have had to become at least technology savvy as companies have adopted more and more technology. However, cybersecurity has typically fallen under oversight of something like an audit committee, which, in and of itself doesn't necessarily require any sort of security expertise on it either. They just typically put security under the oversight of that committee. So I do think, again, kind of extending upon the conversation we're having, that it is a pretty big miss, right, when you think about being able to utilize or strengthen the boardroom as a cybersecurity control. I feel that was a big miss here by not requiring some level of cyber expertise on the board. It doesn't necessarily mean that has to be a CISO either, right? It certainly can be someone on the board who just has the proper expertise to be able to be that advocate on the board. When you think about the just understanding at that level the systemic cyber risk that exists within an organization, and being able to help also advocate for the direct and indirect value that's created by having strong cybersecurity practices within an organization, right? Because as we're talking about materiality as it results from a breach, you're likely also talking about a significant amount of cost that a company is going to have to absorb when and if they have an incident. And by being able to have somebody on the board who can advocate for having those strong cybersecurity practices outside of the CISO coming in and giving their update, it creates, to use Aidan's word a bit earlier, more that culture around ensuring that security has a stronger seat at the table.
Well, it makes it tough too, because you're tasked with basically doing more with less, right? But also you're supposed to be enabling the business in all these different aspects. So if somebody's not there to help advocate for you to get that role accomplished, it's got to be tough.
Well, and you think about where these new rules are going to lead, right? One of the things that I think is going to come out of these new rules is CISOs are going to face new expectations, new responsibilities, and a greater spotlight on what they're doing and the program that they're building, without necessarily an increase in board support and understanding. And so I think that's going to make their jobs a little bit more difficult. But also, but on the positive side, right? As I talked about the negatives and the positives, I think it's also going to require CISOs to do a better job of communicating issues to the board within the context of materiality, because speaking the language of the business is going to be even more important than it already is. I mean, the role of the CISO has certainly evolved over the course of the past 10 years or so, to where you are expected to be, as we talked about earlier, more of a business enabler, more of a business leader. Outside the technical expertise you're expected to bring to the role, you're also now expected to bring a much larger business acumen to the role as well, and the ability to be able to speak to the board at that level and in their terms that they understand. And if you can't do that already, then that's certainly a skill that's going to become more and more important in this role as these rules and regulations become more I can't talk now. As these rules and regulations are becoming more in effect, right? And as companies are utilizing them more as a result of having to disclose issues when they happen.
Excellent. Let's pause here with you. I want to give Aidan a chance to kind of talk about his piece as well. So Aidan, you're coming from a different perspective entirely. So you can actually kind of help us with, kind of the path forward, I believe. So let's hear from you, and then we're going to dig into some more questions.
Yeah, I think just going back to Sam's point earlier, I mean, the fact is most companies will have problems with breaches. It's not a case of if, it's a case of when. Like it's likely, right? But I think one of the things that you want to try and make sure that you're able to do is just prioritize and make sure that you're able to identify the materiality of the breach if and when it happens. And I think that's often sometimes the challenge is, figuring out you've been breached is one thing, but understanding the impact, understanding the materiality of it is quite a challenge. Like figuring out what that actually means when it's happened is a real problem. Certainly, we see that with quite a few of the companies that we speak to, is that they wouldn't know the actual impact of what's actually happened. So I think in many regards, I think we kind of come at this from a pretty simplistic perspective, and we're like, well, hang on, what is it that Like what data actually, from a data perspective, what data do you actually have that matters? Like what is it that would be material if it were to become compromised, if it were to be breached as well? Because I think that that's quite often the challenge that a lot of companies have, is they don't actually know what it is, that they've got, and they wouldn't know whether it would be material. If they had a breach, they wouldn't know whether it was material or not. So I think that in some regards, we're quite simplistic. So it's about figuring out what you've got, working out what it matters, making sure that you know who has access, whether they really need access as well, making sure that it's safe by design, making sure you actually know, how it's moving and operating inside or around your organization as well. Because until you can sort of answer those questions, your ability to be able to sort of respond or prevent a breach is limited. So I think the first thing is just get visibility, figure out what it is that you've got that matters. And then that's a really good starting point. I don't know whether you'd agree with me on that, Sam, but that's my perspective on that anyway.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think everything, when you think about building a security program, starts with understanding what you have and where it is, right? And that's just not from a systems perspective, but it's also from a data perspective, right? When people think about things like asset management, for example, right? And understanding not only your on-prem assets, your cloud assets, your third-party assets. I mean, all of those various systems have data that could potentially be material and could also potentially result in some sort of incident. And I think that also starts to talk about, when you think about materiality, right? We've used that term a lot already, but I think understanding what that really means for a company is going to be extremely important in figuring out, do we need to disclose, right? And I think there's more to it than just the quantitative aspect of, like, this breach is going to cost us, $5 million, for example, in notification and fines and other things, right? What else do you need to think about? Things like maybe harm to reputation or competitiveness in the marketplace or possibility of litigation, right? Because part of the reason for the new rules is not only to create more accountability for companies to disclose in a kind of standardized way when they have an incident, but it's also to help protect investors, right? Because investors are making decisions on whether they are investing in companies based off of, in some cases, whether or not they had an incident. People in the CISO role are sometimes making decisions as to whether they're going to work with specific companies or buy products from specific companies based off of whether or not they've had an incident. Now, granted, of course, like I said earlier, everyone's going to have an incident at some point, so it's not like it's the only determining factor. But if if there's a company that's had multiple repeated incidents over a short period of time, that may weigh into the third-party risk assessment that the CISO does to determine whether or not they're going to work with that organization. So there's a lot of things you have to consider when you're thinking about materiality, and also think about why these rules exist now to begin with.
Love that you brought that up, Sam, because I will say, investor protection is one, market transparency, two of those that you came on, but you latched onto. But I also thought about, one of the reasons for public companies to have these disclosures is the equal access for all investors to have the same access to the information. What happens if some of the investors know that there was a cyber incident, right, before this requirement, and some investors don't know, and there doesn't seem to be any change, but that there's going to be this year after year ripple effect happening, where a lot of cybersecurity incidents, working on the forensic side and also working on the operational side, reacting to it isn't just a 1 month project. It's not a 2 month project. It is year after year that you might have new language that you have on your website, scripts that you have with every employee, responses to every RFP that you put forward. So I really like that you looked at kind of how is this, the purpose of it, because this is the first thing besides, HIPAA requires you to have that public disclosure. Every other privacy law and requirement is telling you to go notify, John Doe over there, and they know, but there's not this wide dissemination of, hey, public disclosure. So to me, that when I was first learning about these SEC, the model cybersecurity rule that they were putting out over the last year and a half, that stood out to me as going, wait, well, this is very different than what companies are looking at responding to cyber events now, because they're looking at the privacy aspect and not specifically to the actual technical cybersecurity impact and that material like overall impact to investors.
It's a really interesting point. So, Violet, when I first started reading through these new rules, I think one of the things I took this as a very positive step. Actually, I definitely thought this is great, because one of the challenges we often have when we talk to a lot of organisations about data security is they're kind of like, well, it's such a difficult problem to fix because it involves like multiple departments in the business, and I struggle to get that level of engagement I want with the different departments and different functions. So I was like, well, this is a good thing. This is actually this makes it more of a, this is actually a bit more of a driver and a bit of a catalyst for change to hopefully kind of change that culture and create, make data part of everything. Because when you look at some, so much of it is about determining material, whether it's material, you can't do that unless you understand the data. You just can't do that unless you get closer to the actual stuff that matters the most. And I think that's actually a really positive thing. And I'm hopeful that will be a catalyst to change the security culture as well.
Well, I think this also, where we're kind of dancing around here, is that this is effectively promoting cyber risk to the level of other material corporate risks, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Excellent. I've got a question in the Q&A from the audience I want to throw at you guys. Basically, I think it's actually for Sam, but as a CISO, can you give an example on how a steering committee enforces director buy-in for a successful security program with mitigating risk or change?
So repeat the first part of the question again, how a steering committee promotes successful buy-in?
Yeah, example of how a steering committee enforces director buy-in for a successful security program with mitigating risk and change. Number 2 in the Q&A.
Yeah, I don't know if you can really enforce buy-in at the director level, but it's certainly, I think these certainly can help to influence director buy-in at that level, just because of the fact that there is accountability, right, from the CISO's perspective in how they now need to think differently, I would say, about their security program and how they communicate that up to the board and how they align with the business on how progress within the security program is being made, but also how that potentially affects the material risks of the organization. And I think that's an important conversation to have, because, as we were talking about earlier, because of the fact that a lot of times CISOs go into the boardroom and they give their 10, 15-minute update on the state of the business and the state of the security program, and they talk about how great things are, and they maybe ask for money on some of the things that aren't going so well. But there is a larger discussion that has to be had that circles around what things are most important to the business and how do we make sure that as a team we're moving forward on those things, not just shining the light on the CISO and making sure the CISO is executing, who ultimately, of course, is accountable for making those things happen. But there is also going to be, I don't want to say culpability at the board level, because that's probably not the right word, but certainly there is more awareness that needs to take place at the board level to ensure that not only are those risks being identified, but those risks are being handled. Because if they aren't being handled, then there are potentially larger risks at play when you have to disclose, as Violet was saying, right, to the general public on the issues that occurred. And I would say that also, while the SEC's purview is primarily over public companies, I would say that this isn't necessarily just a discussion for public companies to have, right? If you work for a private company, I think there's still a lot of important discussion to come out of this that should be happening even for the CISOs and the leadership teams and the boards of private companies as well. Even if you're not necessarily imposed the same requirements that the SEC is putting on public companies, I think the driver for this type of discussion around importance to the business and alignment with the executive team and the board at that level is something that should be happening regardless of the size of company that you're in.
Interesting. Do you both agree with that, with the non-public companies?
I think it's actually in some ways a challenge, because for the private companies, I mean, they don't need to disclose anything. They should be part of their culture, but they don't need to. So I think that in some ways it's a disadvantage for the public companies here.
I would take the opposite view, because I have seen where companies, as non-public companies, can range all different sizes, right? We know that it can be all different sizes, and what ends up happening if you have the same requirements that are, example, I love that PCI DSS has a breakdown of different types of merchants, right? I think that that's really thoughtful. There's other breakdowns and other regulations that break down different sizes of organizations, but it really breaks my heart when we get a breach call or, you know, a cyber hotline call in the past, and it was, you know, a 2-person owned doctor's office that doesn't have the huge budget for IT and security and doesn't really know how to do the requirements. Not that they shouldn't have to do something, but that there is, it's very, very hard to require a risk assessment of a group that can't, you know, is just barely paying a third-party IT. So what I think across the board requirements of non-public, see, I do like that this is just public companies. My point is, if it was all non-public companies as well, you'd have a disparity of it adversely impacting smaller companies more than it does larger companies, because larger companies would get it and understand it and put budget toward it, and smaller companies would be like, well, you wouldn't have the innovation at a small microeconomic level.
And my point wasn't necessarily that the private companies should, you know, be following the same standards that the public companies are. I'm just saying that internally, the conversation should be happening around, you know, what is important and how do we make sure that we're protecting the things that are most important, even if you don't have to disclose.
Well, I think it's also a good conversation to have and throw in cyber insurance now, because one of the holistic things you're thinking about as a CISO is, okay, we're accepting this risk. We're adding software for this risk. We're accepting these risks. We're mitigating these and transferring these. Where does cyber insurance come into play? And I think the other big question with the new SEC disclosure issues are, wait a second, there's 2 different types of insurance that are at play here. We have cyber insurance that covers cyber incidents usually, and we have D&O insurance that covers decisions and actions and discrepancies, errors and omissions from directors and officers. So you have D&O and cyber usually excludes D&O issues, and D&O usually excludes cyber issues. So there might be a huge gap here that we're not realizing, and the SEC regulations are kind of highlighting or magnifying that gap.
And I would say as a CISO, if you are, you know, especially given the increased spotlight that's going to be put on the role and on the function, if you're currently not included on your company's D&O policy, this is a good opportunity to start having that discussion to be included, because there certainly has been a few publicized incidents where, you know, the CISO has been called into question and the CISO has been put under scrutiny or even potentially have been charged with things that typically they would not have been charged with in the past. So I think if you're not on that policy, you should be having the discussion on how to be included, because any cybersecurity incident, you want to make sure that your liability protections are adjusted to include, and this is coming from my biased opinion, right? It should be adjusted to include that position, because, and if you're looking for a CISO role or you're interviewing for a CISO role, I think that should be part of the discussion that you're having with the company that you're interviewing with. Because remember, interviews go both ways, right? Not only are they interviewing you to see if you're a good fit for the company, but also you need to make sure that you are going to have the proper protections in place coming into that role in the event that an incident happens, because you don't want to end up being potentially personally liable or personally sued because an incident happened that, you know, potentially could have been avoided for any number of myriad of reasons. So again, that's my biased point of view. I don't know if others have a different opinion on that, but I think, you know, if CISOs aren't already having that discussion or aren't already included in their D&O policy, they should be starting those discussions.
Let's shift gears a bit. I want to find out, you know, how do we fix this, or how do we kind of get people on the right path going along here? So if you wouldn't mind, let's start with Aidan on my next question. Where should companies prioritize their efforts and their resources as they're trying to get their arms around this?
I mean, I'm incredibly biased, of course.
But it's fair. I mean, you have solutions, right? So.
I come at this from the basis that I believe that all that really matters is the data. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, like that's key. And I think that, you know, the most important thing, the step number one, is work out what it is you've got that you care about. Work out what you've got that matters. Work out, I mean, that's obviously a business conversation, because for different organizations, different types of data will matter. So, you know, have that conversation with people inside the organization. You know, figure out what it is that you've got that would actually be material, or would actually be a problem if it was become breached. Like, the second logical step, in my opinion, is like make sure that only those people that need access have access. Like reduce levels of access to your most sensitive data. It's one of the most effective things you can do at preventing a breach. So, and to just make sure that you don't have this situation. I mean, it's so easy for it to spiral out of control. I totally understand how challenging it is to keep the right levels of controls around data, but it's so fundamentally important. So understand who has access to the data that really matters the most. Because again, a massive reason why breaches happen, people have access to data they just don't need access to. So if you can come up with mechanisms to reduce levels of access, I believe that that's really important as well. And then the third thing, of course, is for me is just like know what's happening to it. Like one thing we haven't really touched on here is I think that every single day companies have breaches they don't even know about. They have people sharing data. They have people like in both externally and internally, and organizations just don't know it's happening. So make sure that you've got those controls and visibility around what's actually happening to the data that matters the most. Because at the end of the day, I mean, you will have a problem like, you will have problems inside your organization. User accounts will become compromised. People will click on links in emails that they shouldn't click in. Like you will have problems like this, right? So the only effective thing you can do is get closer to the stuff that matters the most. Like maybe quite a simplistic opinion here on this, but unlike if you don't know what data you have that you should be protecting, you're going to struggle to protect it. If you don't know that, if you can't accurately say that people have, if you can't reduce levels of access to data and make sure that broadly only those people that need have access, you're opening yourself up for unnecessary risk. And there are ways to fix these problems. So I guess, it's prioritize on the data, figure out what matters, reduce levels of access, understanding even at a basic level what's happening to your most sensitive data, and that's a really good start.
Appreciate that. Violet, same question for you. I mean, where can people kind of get started from your perspective?
Oh man, I think, well, I actually love Aidan's point. I think data is one of the most misunderstood subjects in our world of cybersecurity privacy. Like, where is data inventory, and all of these regulations? And in fact, I have a whole class. I have 12 modules in the class I teach, and one is just on data, just really understanding that impact. I think that is a really good place to start. But I would also add making sure that this is clearly a big update to the financial aspect of cybersecurity and privacy. So I feel like at this point, CFO really needs to step up to say, okay, what do we need to get in place financially to make sure that we're covered from a risk management perspective? Because of course, we're going to have cybersecurity going, I'm on the risk assessment, I'm on pen testing, okay, I'm on vendor management, and you have all of these different pieces going. You need someone in the financial area to say, okay, well, financially, how are we covering ourselves from continuing to do business if that event occurred? And if that materiality was hit, we have to figure it out. So that includes kind of the cyber insurance piece that I was talking about, but also increased budgets for some of the things that this is going to require of security and privacy. So I think finance area just needs to step up here and say, we're not just going to sign off on these things anymore when it happens, but really look at how this is going to affect the financial, like this is now a cost of doing business. So factor that in.
I see you guys are shaking your head. Sam, what are you thinking, Sam? You're shaking your head or nodding.
Yeah, I was actually going to tie that into one of the points I was going to make, so I think it's perfectly said. From a CISO's perspective, I think there's a few things you can do right now. First and foremost, and it's something I mentioned a few times already, but it bears repeating because I think it's the most important, so I'll say it again. Meet with your business leaders to align business risk and what's material to the business, right? Have those discussions now so that you can streamline your process when and if you have to disclose an incident, right? This is not a discussion you should be having after an incident occurs. It's too late then. You should be preparing and having those discussions now so you're in alignment with your business before the incident even happens. Second, document your company's approach to how you do cyber risk assessment, identification, and management. I mean, this is a specific requirement that's spelled out in the new rules. So I offer it as a suggestion of something you could do right now, but it's ultimately going to be a requirement of what you have to do to be in compliance with the rules. So again, start that process now. If you don't know how to do it, then I'd recommend using some well-defined standard that exists, like NIST. Sometimes getting these things started and getting them off the ground can be the hardest part of getting started. I often use the term turning potential energy into kinetic energy. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do is start from nothing and create something. But you don't have to start from nothing. You can utilize some of the frameworks and standards that already exist to help you have a starting point to get moving. Also, Violet mentioned earlier about how these disclosures are now public information for everybody, right? They're filed as part of your 8K. So look at disclosures that already exist and determine how you potentially want to use some of the wording that they use to communicate their own incidents. I'm sure we've all had situations where we've seen an incident that has occurred and said, wow, they really did a great job communicating and disclosing what happened in the incident and what they're doing about it and how it affected them. And then there's the opposite side of the coin where you said, wow, if I ever have an incident, I am never going to do it that way, right? So utilize the public disclosures that are already being created to pick up some interesting tidbits for your own that you may want to use in your own disclosure, and also possibly pick up some things that you don't want to do as well. And last is identify areas of improvement for your company security posture today. If you haven't already done so, make a plan and then act on it. And this comes directly back to what Violet was talking about a moment ago on investment and getting the CFO in the discussion and the cost of doing business, and not having security only get investment after the event occurs and then they realize, oh, we didn't spend a whole lot of money that we should have spent on these things to help prevent this thing from happening after it's already happened. Have the conversation, create the plan, understand what the budget's going to be required to be able to act on that plan, and then execute.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I've often kind of wondered why CFOs don't come to our events with their CISO counterparts. It kind of seemed like it would make sense. That way you don't go crazy and buy too much stuff. But then we want you to buy stuff too, right? So
that's actually one of the biggest pieces missing when I do tabletops. And over the last 8 years, over 350 tabletops, the biggest roles missing is CFO, and every now and then communications or marketing. But CFO is the one that they always miss on, hey, who's going to sign off on this stuff? Who's going to write the checks? So I think it's a good point.
Somebody's got to pay for it, right? So one last thought. We haven't really touched on this, but what's the crystal ball looking like with enforcement on this? How is this going to get enforced? Is there a deadline? That I didn't see one offhand. So I'm going to lean on you, Violet. What's enforcement of all this look like?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask this question because I don't know. But I will say there's a certain language in the actual press release from SEC that I was asking a lot of people. So maybe there's like some commentary that comes up, or someone can look it up while we're talking. It says this, I'm going from memory because I don't have it pulled up, but this new disclosure rule will go into effect as soon as it's recorded and accepted in the Federal Register. And I was like, what the hell does that mean? I'm not an SEC lawyer. That's why I don't know. But I'm sure my lawyer friends would know what that means. But it feels like it's leaving open an extra step. And I don't know what that extra step is. So I do know that there are December 2023 dates, meaning like if this isn't done by then, that's the drop dead deadline of when it's going to go into effect. So we can say at least by December, but does anyone else on the panel know if it's coming in before that, if whatever the Federal Register addition means?
From what I've read, it wasn't very clear, to be honest with you, so no.
Okay, I feel like I'm the only one calling off the lack of clarity, so it feels good to hear you say that too, because
No, I don't think it's been.
It hasn't been in any of the blogs or anything. Like
No.
I haven't seen what that means, that specific thing of going, accepted into the Federal Register.
Michael's saying December 15th from the audience.
Well, I think that's unless it's accepted earlier. Like it could be accepted tomorrow, gotcha. And that's what we're trying to figure out. So agree with you on the December dates as drop dead deadlines. But, here we go. How long does it take for something? It says usually around 3 business days, but depends on the submitting agency when it's pulled. So it feels like it's unclear.
Gotcha. Okay. We'll have to revisit this. in Q4 somewhere?
Sorry, I don't have the answer.
That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. You didn't say it depends, which I appreciate because I always get that from my lawyers. Like, oh, it depends. I'm like, oh God, just answer the question. Thank you for that, though. I appreciate it. Let's see. What else do we have in here in the Q&A? Another comment. The Federal Register is published regularly. Once it's published, it's in effect. Okay, so same thing. So none of us really know. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Once it is released, we'll throw that out in SecureWorld News. And maybe we'll even get a comment from our panel here. Another question or comment coming in. What is this? Oh, what is does anybody know this one? What do the penalties look like for late reporting? Do we know this? Good question.
I knew I should have had it pulled up.
We talked about this before. If you're out in the audience, we were like, should we bring it up? Should we have this thing? It's okay.
Oh, you know what? They were officially published in the Federal Register on August 4th. Here we go. So they are in effect. I'm going to send it to you over chat. There's a JD Supra article on it. And I'm going to be looking up the other answer.
Okay. Why don't you look up that answer? And then we'll kind of get things kind of progress. We're almost out of time, but I want to get that answer if we can. So we'll come back to Violet. But in the meantime, Aidan, give us your final thought. If nothing else, what should folks... go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the final rule becomes effective 30 days after publication in the Federal Register. So 30 days after August 4th, which is September 5th, 2023. So September 5th is the magic date.
Thank you. You heard it here first, folks. September 5th.
Well, you know, also from Paul Hastings' blog, combined with Gibson Dunn's blog, you know, so other lawyers did their work there.
We'll give them credit. Thank you, Violet, for checking that out. Aidan, final thought. If nothing else, what should folks, we talked about, you know, what they should start doing, but give us a final thought, if nothing else, or some homework.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, my final thoughts really is I read this and I was pretty positive about this. I thought this was I think it's a very positive step. And I think that, you know, but I think it's disappointing we haven't got that cybersecurity expertise. I think that that's something that I don't understand that. I think that's something that I'm hoping when, you know, there's new iteration that we change. But I think that, you know, I think overall it's a really positive regulation. And I was really encouraged to see it. And I think generally, like, you know, the security culture is becoming more business focused, and I think that it is becoming more. There's more and more board awareness certainly that we're seeing out there. So I think we're heading in the right direction. It's good to see things like this. Good to see more regulation. And I think that, yeah, really positive from my perspective, anyway. Certainly.
Appreciate it, Sam. What about you?
Yeah. So, like we talked about earlier, right? This is intended to be something that helps protect investors, but also I think. Also, it's intended to help drive a higher level of maturity within organizations as well. So, you know, like we said, positives and negatives on both sides. But and like we talked about earlier, obviously nobody wants to have an incident, and sometimes having that discussion with management around the fact that incidents will happen is a difficult one because of the sometimes unrealistic expectation that is in place around having a CISO in place and the fact that, you know, they're supposed to protect from all incidents. But while that's not practical, I think, you know, having honest, realistic conversations with the business to help establish more of a partnership will instead, when an incident happens, hopefully turn it more into less into a finger pointing exercise and more of into hey, all right, we determined what this is, we talked about what this was, how do we get through this together? You know, we've certainly talked about the SEC excluding the cybersecurity expertise in the boardroom as being a pretty big miss, and how that will continue to leave CISOs with a, quite frankly, fairly weak to non-existent boardroom support and advocacy or advocate in the boardroom. But as we talked about earlier, look at this as an opportunity to strengthen those board relationships, strengthen those executive relationships, have real discussions on priority and materiality, because as one door closes, one door opens, right? And I hope that while these new rules, while they were less than what we were hoping for, at least, again, speaking as a security leader, that we don't let a good crisis go to waste, and that we use this opportunity to have the discussions that we need to have to ensure that we're well aligned with the business so we can have stronger working relationships for mutual benefit.
Thank you, sir. And Violet, same thing. Any homework or final thoughts on our topic?
Oh, man. benefits and costs of I'm trying to look through the actual rule, which is 186 pages. And when you look up fines and penalties, it does not narrow it down. So my final suggestion is to figure out how much it costs, because I do know that the SEC crackdown on fines and penalties for cybersecurity issues have increased exponentially even over the last 3 years. And we've seen SolarWinds with what was the letter called? The warning letter that they had to investigate. So we're seeing that they're strategically coming very forward thinking into cybersecurity. And so if you're a public company, you really need to pay attention to these rules. I think honestly, it's coming on even stronger than we saw GDPR enforcement, because they're already giving guidance and putting forward, teeth to this requirement. So homework is go figure out how much you could get hit for.
It's probably good to know, honestly. I mean, you need to know this stuff.
It's in there somewhere. It's in the 186 pages somewhere.
Somebody should feed that to ChatGPT and figure it out.
No, it doesn't do. Oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry. I was going to say it doesn't do real time. It's old information, but I guess if you copied and pasted all the content and asked it to find it.
There's like a plugin too now, I guess. So.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you guys. That concludes our time. I've got a couple quick announcements as we wrap up, but thank you all. We're doing a part 2 to this in a couple weeks, so I will also try to find out and make sure our folks there figure out what the penalties are looking like, because this is actually after that deadline of September 5th. So this will actually be kind of fresh information at that point. So, but thank you guys for joining us. Really appreciate Violet, Sam, and Aidan taking time out of their day to join us here on the remote sessions. So thank you guys for that. We have more stuff on the way. Like I said, part 2 for this is September 7th. There's a link in the resource tab there to join that. So please join us for our second part. And then we're going to start getting you ready for Security Awareness Month in October. On the 19th, we've got 20 years of Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We've got our partnership with our friends over there. I'm going to keep that one a secret for a while. No spoilers. But we're also going to be doing hacking your digital identity, how cyber criminals can and will get around your authentication methods. So that's going to be a know before, it sounds like, on September 28th. So join us there. Again, all of these are in the resource tab. There's some great documents in there from our sponsor Spirion as well, who I want to say thank you to for making today's remote session possible. So if you haven't already, grab that CPE credit down there in the widget bar as well. If you have any problems with that, shoot me an email, tomb@secureworld.io. This concludes today's remote session. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again on the 7th. So take care. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.